The sound of my own footsteps echoing on concrete stairs had become my evening ritual. Down into the basement I'd go, past the water heater and storage boxes, to what my daughter-in-law Cassandra cheerfully called Grandma's cozy corner. A twin bed pushed against the wall, a small lamp that flickered when the washing machine ran, and a space heater that barely took the chill off the Milwaukee winter air. This was my bedroom in the house I'd bought and paid for, the house where I'd raised my son Marcus, the house that was supposed to be my sanctuary in my golden years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Instead, I was living like a tenant in my own home, banished to the basement because Cassandra needed the upstairs guest room for her creative space, and the master bedroom obviously belonged to her and Marcus. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sleeping beneath the very floorboards I'd walked as a young mother, teaching Marcus to tie his shoes and helping him with homework at the kitchen table, directly above my head. But tonight was different. Tonight, as I descended those familiar steps carrying my arthritis medication and a glass of water, I'd made a decision that would change everything. In my other hand, I clutched a manila folder that contained documents Cassandra had no idea I possessed. Documents that would prove what I'd suspected for months. Documents that would give me back my power and my dignity. I sat on the edge of that narrow bed, opened the folder and stared at the property deed, with my name clearly printed as the sole owner. Tomorrow I would begin the process that would teach my son and his wife a lesson they'd never forget. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the most dangerous secrets. The basement had become my prison over the course of 18 months, but it took me far longer to understand how I'd ended up there. Looking back, I can see the signs I ignored, the small compromises I made that led to larger ones, until I found myself exiled to the lowest level of my own home. But understanding the journey requires going back to the beginning, back to when I thought I was gaining a daughter instead of losing my son. My name is Norma Peterson, and at 73 I thought I'd seen enough of life to recognize manipulation when it walked through my front door. I was wrong. Cassandra arrived in Marcus's life like a whirlwind, all bright smiles and enthusiastic compliments about my cooking, my decorating, my adorable little house. She was 28 to his 35, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an Instagram account full of inspirational quotes about family and gratitude. She called me Mom Peterson from the very first dinner, hugged me goodbye after every visit, and sent me thoughtful text messages about how lucky Marcus was to have such a wonderful mother. I should have been suspicious when someone tried that hard to win me over, but I was lonely. My husband Frank had passed 3 years earlier, and Marcus had been so busy with his accounting firm that I rarely saw him. When Cassandra came along, suddenly my phone was ringing again. Suddenly there were dinner invitations and shopping trips and long conversations about wedding plans. I felt needed, wanted, important again. The wedding was small but lovely, held in the backyard of my house on Maple Street. I'd owned the modest 2-story home for 32 years, had raised Marcus there after Frank and I divorced when the boy was 12. Frank had moved to Arizona, remarried, and died of a heart attack before Marcus turned 25. The house was all mine, paid off years ago, filled with memories and furniture I'd collected over decades of making a home. Cassandra loved the house from the moment she first saw it. She gushed about the original hardwood floors, the vintage kitchen with its checkered tile backsplash, the built-in bookshelves in the living room. She took photos of everything, posting them on social media with captions like, "Future mother-in-law has the most charming home," and "Can't wait to make memories here." I was flattered by her attention, proud that my simple house impressed someone so young and energetic. The first few months after the wedding were blissful. Marcus and Cassandra lived in his cramped downtown apartment, but they spent most weekends at my house. Cassandra would cook elaborate brunches while I played with their new puppy, a golden retriever named Buster, who immediately became the center of my universe. We'd sit on the front porch in the evenings, the three of us, talking about their plans for the future, their dreams of starting a family, their hopes for building something meaningful together. It was during one of these conversations that Cassandra first mentioned how much she worried about me living alone. "Mom Peterson," she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand, "it just breaks my heart thinking of you in this big house all by yourself. What if something happened? What if you fell or had a medical emergency? Marcus would never forgive himself if something happened to you and we weren't here to help. I assured her I was fine, that I had neighbors who checked on me and a medical alert bracelet I wore religiously. But she persisted, planting seeds of doubt about my ability to maintain the house, to handle emergencies, to live independently. She was subtle about it, always framing her concerns as love and worry rather than criticism. She'd point out a loose banister or a squeaky floorboard, mentioning how dangerous these things could be for someone my age. She'd offer to help me organize my medications or set up a grocery delivery service, suggesting that maybe I was taking on too much for someone in my 70s. The conversation about moving in together started slowly, casually. Cassandra would mention how expensive their rent was, how they were trying to save money for a down payment on a house of their own. She'd talk about how much she missed having family around, how her own parents lived in Oregon and she rarely saw them. She'd say things like, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all live together for a while? Just until we get on our feet financially?" And, "I know it's a lot to ask, but having you close by would make me feel so much more secure about starting a family." Marcus was hesitant at first. He remembered his teenage years, the normal friction between mother and son that comes with growing up. But Cassandra wore him down with her enthusiasm, her practical arguments about saving money and taking care of me. She painted a picture of multi-generational living that sounded warm and supportive, like something from a family sitcom where everyone learned valuable lessons and hugged it out by the end of each episode. When they finally asked officially, I said yes without hesitation. I was thrilled at the prospect of having my family close, of being needed again, of having voices and laughter fill the house that had been too quiet for too long. We agreed they'd move into the master bedroom, which made sense, since it was the largest room and had its own bathroom. I'd take the smaller bedroom down the hall, the one that had been Marcus's when he was growing up. It seemed poetic somehow, like we were coming full circle. The first month was everything I'd hoped for. Cassandra cooked dinner most nights, elaborate meals that she'd photograph and post online with captions about the joys of family life. Marcus seemed happier than I'd seen him in years, more relaxed and affectionate. We'd watch movies together in the evenings, take Buster for walks around the neighborhood, spend lazy Sunday mornings reading the paper and drinking coffee. I felt like I was part of a real family again, not just a woman living alone with her memories. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with small requests that seemed perfectly reasonable. Cassandra needed space for her yoga practice, so could I move my sewing machine out of the sunroom? She was working on a big project for her freelance.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Marketing business, so could I keep the television volume down in the evenings? She'd bought new furniture for the living room, a matching set in cream and gold that was much more modern than my old pieces, so could we put my furniture in storage for now? Each request came with an explanation that made perfect sense. Each change was presented as temporary, just until they got settled, or finished a project, or saved enough money for their own place. I went along with everything because I wanted to be accommodating, because I wanted this living arrangement to work, because I was grateful to have my family close and didn't want to rock the boat. The requests became more frequent and more intrusive. Cassandra needed the guest room for her office, so could I move my computer and desk into my bedroom? She was hosting a book club meeting, so could I maybe visit my sister for the evening? She was trying a new recipe that required the entire kitchen, so could I eat dinner a little earlier or a little later? She'd invited some friends over for a wine tasting, so could I maybe watch television upstairs in my room instead of in the living room? I found myself tiptoeing around my own house, constantly checking with Cassandra before making plans or using common areas. I'd ask permission to use the kitchen, to watch a particular television show, to have my sister over for coffee. I told myself this was just the natural adjustment period that comes with sharing space, that we were all learning to live together, and these growing pains were temporary. But the growing pains kept growing. 6 months after they moved in, Cassandra announced that she was pregnant. The news was joyful, but it came with a new set of requirements and restrictions. She needed absolute quiet for her morning sickness, so could I please not run the vacuum or washing machine before 10 a.m.? She couldn't tolerate certain smells, so could I avoid cooking fish or using air fresheners? She needed the guest room as a nursery, so could I move my things somewhere else? That somewhere else turned out to be the basement. "It's just temporary," Cassandra assured me, rubbing her still flat belly and looking appropriately apologetic. "Just until after the baby comes and we figure out a more permanent solution. The basement is actually quite cozy, and you'll have so much more privacy down there. Plus, you won't have to worry about the baby waking you up at night." I should have said no. I should have put my foot down and insisted that the pregnant woman and her husband figure out their own living arrangements if they needed more space. But I was so excited about becoming a grandmother, so invested in this family unit we'd created, that I convinced myself it really was temporary. I told myself that sacrificing my comfort for a few months was a small price to pay for the joy of having a grandchild. The basement wasn't cozy. It was cold and damp, with concrete walls that made every sound echo. The ceiling was low, making me feel claustrophobic, and the small windows near the ceiling let in barely any natural light. I bought a dehumidifier to combat the moisture, a space heater to ward off the chill, and several lamps to brighten the gloom. I tried to make it homey with some of my displaced furniture and family photos, but it felt like I was living in a bunker. Cassandra's pregnancy progressed, and with it came more rules and restrictions. I couldn't use the main bathroom during her morning routine, because she needed privacy for her prenatal preparations. I couldn't cook strong-smelling foods because they triggered her nausea. I couldn't have visitors over because she needed rest and quiet. I couldn't watch television in the living room because she was doing prenatal yoga or meditation or reading pregnancy books. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, floating through the upper floors only when absolutely necessary, spending most of my time in the basement trying to stay out of everyone's way. I ate my meals down there, watched television down there, read books down there. I emerged only to use the kitchen when it was empty, to check the mail, to take brief walks around the neighborhood for fresh air and sanity. Marcus seemed oblivious to how dramatically our living situation had changed. He worked long hours at his accounting firm, often not coming home until after 7 p.m. By then, Cassandra had usually prepared dinner and set up the evening's activities, whether that was watching a movie, discussing baby names, or reviewing nursery furniture catalogs. When he was home, his attention was completely focused on his pregnant wife and their future child. I understood this was natural and appropriate, but it left me feeling increasingly invisible and irrelevant. The baby arrived on a snowy February morning. Little Emma was perfect, with tiny fingers and toes, and a lusty cry that filled the house with new life. I was over the moon, finally holding my granddaughter, feeling that rush of love and protectiveness that comes with being a grandmother. For a brief moment, I thought everything would be worth it, that all the sacrifices and accommodations would pay off in the joy of being part of this child's life. But even motherhood didn't soften Cassandra's approach to household management. If anything, it made her more controlling and demanding. The baby needed absolute quiet during nap times, so I had to avoid using the stairs or opening doors. The baby was sensitive to different smells, so I couldn't wear perfume or use scented laundry detergent. The baby's schedule was paramount, so I had to adjust my own routine around feeding times and sleep schedules. I wasn't allowed to hold Emma without permission, couldn't pick her up when she was crying, couldn't offer opinions about her care or feeding. Cassandra had strong ideas about child rearing, ideas that didn't include much input from the grandmother. She'd researched every aspect of infant care, from sleep training to feeding schedules to developmental milestones, and she didn't appreciate suggestions or advice from someone whose child-rearing experience was outdated. The basement became my exile. I'd hear Emma crying upstairs and long to comfort her, but I knew better than to interfere. I'd listen to the sounds of family life happening above my head, the cooing and laughing and daily routines that I was excluded from. I felt like I was living in a parallel universe, present but not participating, close but not connected. It was during one of these long, lonely evenings in the basement that I began to really examine my situation. I was 73 years old, living in my own house, paying all the utilities and property taxes, and yet I was relegated to the basement like an unwelcome relative. I was walking on eggshells in my own home, asking permission to use my own kitchen, hiding in my own basement to avoid conflict. This wasn't the golden years I'd imagined, and it certainly wasn't the family life I'd dreamed of. I started paying closer attention to the dynamics upstairs, listening to conversations and observing interactions when I ventured up for meals or errands. What I discovered was troubling. Cassandra spoke about the house as if it were hers, making plans for renovations and redecorating without consulting me. She talked about our house and our home when speaking to friends and family, as if I were just a tenant or temporary guest. She made decisions about everything from the thermostat setting to the television channels to the grocery shopping, all without asking my opinion or preferences. Most disturbing was how she spoke about me to others. I overheard phone conversations where she complained about having to deal with me, about how I was set in my ways and resistant to change. She portrayed herself as the long-suffering daughter-in-law who was nobly caring for her husband's difficult mother, sacrificing her own comfort and convenience for the sake of family duty. She told her friends that I was getting forgetful and not as sharp as I used to be, suggesting that I needed supervision and care. She mentioned my health issues and mobility problems, exaggerating minor aches and pains into major concerns. She painted a picture of herself as my caregiver, the responsible adult who was managing a household that included an aging, declining mother-in-law. None of this was true. I was in excellent health for my age, with no cognitive decline or serious medical issues. I was fully capable of living independently, managing my own finances and making my own decisions. But Cassandra was crafting a narrative that served her purposes, one that positioned her as the responsible party and me as the dependent burden. The most painful part was watching Marcus accept this narrative without question. He seemed to believe that I was becoming frail and forgetful, that I needed their care and supervision. He spoke to me in the careful, patient tone people use with elderly relatives who might not understand complex concepts. He made decisions about my life without consulting me, assuming that Cassandra knew what was best for everyone. I realized that I was losing not just my home and my independence, but my identity and my dignity. I was becoming the stereotypical burdensome mother-in-law, the aging woman who couldn't take care of herself and needed to be managed by younger, more capable family members. It was a role I'd never auditioned for and certainly didn't want to play. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. I'd been living in the basement for 8 months, and Emma was now crawling and babbling and becoming more interactive. I'd spent the day in my underground room, listening to the sounds of family life above, longing to be part of it but knowing I wasn't welcome. Around dinner time, I heard voices in the kitchen and decided to venture upstairs to prepare a simple meal for myself. I found Cassandra and Marcus at the kitchen table with a pile of papers spread between them, deep in conversation about something that looked official and important. "Oh," Cassandra said when she saw me, quickly gathering the papers and sliding them into a folder. "We didn't realize you were coming up. We're just finishing up some paperwork." I noticed the folder was thick, filled with documents that looked legal in nature. There were letterheads and official stamps, the kind of papers that suggested serious business was being conducted. I asked what they were working on, trying to sound casual and friendly. "Just some financial planning," Marcus said vaguely, not meeting my eyes. "Nothing you need to worry about, Mom. Just boring grown-up stuff." The dismissive tones stung, but I didn't press the issue. I made myself a sandwich and retreated to the basement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening, something that involved me but was being kept from me. The way they'd hidden the papers, the guilty looks they'd exchanged, the quick change of subject all suggested that this financial planning was more significant than they wanted me to know. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to their conversations and activities. I noticed more hushed phone calls, more mysterious paperwork, more private meetings in the kitchen after they thought I was asleep. I heard fragments of conversations about property values and estate planning and long-term care options. My suspicions were confirmed when I overheard Cassandra talking to her mother on the phone, a conversation that took place in the living room while I was folding laundry in the basement. The old house's heating vents carried sound between floors, and I could hear every word clearly. The house is worth at least $300,000 now, Cassandra was saying, and it's in a great neighborhood with good schools. It'll be perfect for Emma to grow up in. Marcus thinks we should wait a few more years, but I think we should start the process now, while she's still relatively healthy and mentally sharp. There was a pause while her mother responded, and then Cassandra continued. Well, she's showing signs of decline, you know? She's become very forgetful and confused about things. Last week she couldn't remember where she put her keys, and she's been asking the same questions repeatedly. Marcus is worried about her driving, and honestly, I think she needs more supervision than we can provide. My blood ran cold. I wasn't forgetful or confused. I hadn't lost my keys or asked repetitive questions. I was as mentally sharp as I'd ever been, and my driving was perfectly fine. Cassandra was lying to her mother, creating a false narrative about my mental state and capabilities. The lawyer says it's actually easier if we establish guardianship now before things get worse, Cassandra continued. That way we can make decisions about her care and her property without having to wait for a crisis. It's really the most loving thing to do, to make sure she's protected and cared for properly. Guardianship. The word hit me like a physical blow. They were planning to have me declared incompetent, to take legal control of my life and my property. They were going to steal my house and my independence by claiming I was mentally unfit to care for myself. I sat on the basement steps, heart pounding, as the full scope of their plan became clear. This wasn't just about living arrangements or family dynamics. This was about a calculated scheme to take control of my assets and my life. The months of isolation, the dismissive treatment, the narrative about my declining health and mental capacity, it was all part of a larger plan to justify taking away my rights and my property. I thought about all the times Cassandra had mentioned my forgetfulness or confusion in front of Marcus, how she'd expressed concern about my ability to live independently. I thought about the way she'd gradually isolated me from friends and family, making it seem like I was withdrawing voluntarily rather than being pushed out. I thought about how she'd positioned herself as my caregiver and protector, the responsible adult who was looking out for my best interests. It was a masterful manipulation, executed slowly and carefully over many months. She'd created a situation where I appeared to be a burden and a liability, where taking control of my life seemed like the reasonable and responsible thing to do. She'd convinced my own son that I was declining and needed protection, that she was the loving daughter-in-law who was willing to sacrifice her own comfort to care for his aging mother. But I wasn't declining, and I didn't need protection. I needed to protect myself from the people who were supposed to love and care for me. I needed to fight back against this betrayal before it was too late. That night, I lay awake in the basement, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. I thought about Frank, about the dreams we'd had for our golden years together. I thought about the life I'd built in this house, the memories embedded in every room, the sense of security and belonging that came with homeownership. I thought about Emma, my granddaughter, who would grow up in this house that should have been her inheritance but was being stolen through lies and manipulation. I thought about my options. I could confront Marcus and Cassandra directly, but I knew they'd deny everything and probably accelerate their timeline. I could try to reason with Marcus, to make him see what his wife was doing, but he seemed completely under her influence, and genuinely believed I was declining. I could contact other family members or friends for support, but Cassandra had been carefully managing those relationships, limiting my contact with the outside world, and controlling the narrative about my health and capabilities. No, I needed to be strategic. I needed to be smart and careful and patient. I needed to gather evidence and build a case before making any moves. I needed to prove that I was mentally competent and fully capable of managing my own life and property. I needed to expose Cassandra's lies and manipulation before she could complete her plan. The next morning, I began my research. I used the computer in the basement to look up information about guardianship laws, elder abuse, and financial exploitation. I learned about the legal process required to declare someone incompetent, about the rights of property owners, about the resources available to seniors who were being taken advantage of. I also began documenting everything. I started a journal, recording every conversation, every incident, every example of my mental clarity and physical capability. I made copies of important documents, including the property deed, my financial statements, and my medical records. I took photos of the basement living conditions, of the evidence of my competence and independence. I was careful to be discreet, to avoid raising suspicions about my activities. I continued to play the role of the declining, dependent mother-in-law, but I was gathering strength and evidence for the battle ahead. I was planning my counterattack, preparing to fight for my home, my independence, and my dignity. The folder of documents I'd seen that Thursday night haunted me. I needed to know what was in those papers, what specific steps they were taking to steal my life. I needed to understand their timeline and their strategy so I could develop effective countermeasures. My opportunity came 2 weeks later when Marcus and Cassandra took Emma to a pediatric appointment. They'd be gone for at least 2 hours, enough time for me to search their room and see what I could find. I felt guilty about invading their privacy, but I reminded myself that they were planning to steal my house and my freedom. This was self-defense, not snooping. I climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, my heart racing with anxiety and determination. The room looked different from when I'd slept there, filled with their furniture and belongings, photos of their wedding and Emma's birth. It felt strange being in my own room as an intruder, but I pushed aside the emotional response and focused on my mission. I found the folder in Marcus's desk drawer, along with several other documents that made my blood run cold. There were forms for guardianship proceedings, medical evaluations that I'd never undergone, and financial assessments that painted a picture of a confused, declining elderly woman who needed protection and supervision. But the most shocking document was a power of attorney form with my signature on it. A signature I'd never made, authorizing Cassandra to make medical and financial decisions on my behalf. It was dated 3 months earlier, during a period when I'd been particularly isolated and depressed about my living situation. I stared at the forged signature, my hands trembling with rage and fear. This was it, the smoking gun that proved their criminal intent. They weren't just planning to take advantage of me. They were actively committing fraud to steal my property and my rights. I took photos of every document with my phone, making sure to capture the details clearly. I memorized the names of the lawyers and doctors involved, the dates and deadlines mentioned in the paperwork. I was building a case, gathering evidence that would expose their scheme and protect my interests. When I heard their car in the driveway, I quickly returned everything to its place and hurried back to the basement. I sat on my narrow bed, heart pounding, as I heard them enter the house and resume their normal routines. They had no idea that I'd discovered their plan, that I now had proof of their fraud and manipulation. That night, I began making phone calls. I contacted an attorney who specialized in elder law, explaining my situation and requesting an urgent consultation. I called my doctor and requested copies of my medical records, wanting to establish my mental competence and physical health. I reached out to my sister Margaret, who lived across town, and asked her to visit me the next day. Margaret arrived the following afternoon, shocked by my living conditions and the story I told her. She'd been wondering why I'd been so distant lately, why I'd declined her invitations and seemed withdrawn from family activities. Now she understood that I'd been isolated and manipulated, cut off from my support system by people who were supposed to care for me. "This is elder abuse," she said firmly, looking around the basement with disgust. "Financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, fraud. We need to report this to Adult Protective Services. Immediately." I showed her the photos of the forged documents, the evidence of their criminal behavior. She was horrified by the scope of their deception, by the calculated nature of their plan. She offered to let me stay with her while I fought back, but I declined. I wanted to stay in my own house, to maintain my position and gather more evidence. The attorney I'd contacted, Sarah Mitchell, specialized in cases exactly like mine. She'd seen this pattern before: adult children or their spouses, who gradually isolated and manipulated elderly parents to gain control of their assets. She assured me that I had strong legal grounds to fight back, that the forged documents were clear evidence of fraud. "The key is to act quickly," she advised. "Once they file for guardianship, it becomes much more difficult to challenge." But with the evidence you've gathered, we can file for emergency injunctions to protect your property and your rights. We developed a strategy. I would continue to document everything while Sarah prepared the legal paperwork. We would expose the fraud, challenge the guardianship proceedings, and seek criminal charges against Cassandra for forgery and financial exploitation. We would also explore options for removing them from my house and regaining control of my property. The plan required patience and careful timing. We needed to wait for the right moment to strike, when we had maximum legal advantage and they were most vulnerable. In the meantime, I had to continue playing the role of the declining dependent mother-in-law while secretly preparing for war. It was the most difficult performance of my life. Every day, I had to smile and act grateful while they stole my life piece by piece. I had to pretend to be confused and forgetful, while I was actually sharper and more focused than I'd been in years. I had to live in that basement, isolated and dismissed, while I planned my escape and my revenge. But I was no longer a victim. I was a fighter, armed with evidence and legal support, ready to reclaim my life and my home. Cassandra had underestimated me, assuming that I was a weak, vulnerable old woman who could be easily manipulated and controlled. She was about to learn that she'd picked the wrong target, that this grandmother had teeth and wasn't afraid to use them. The basement might have been my prison, but it was also my fortress, the place where I'd planned my comeback and prepared for battle. Soon, very soon, I would emerge from those concrete walls and take back everything that was rightfully mine. The waiting game was almost over. It was time to show them what happened when you tried to steal from Norma Peterson. The first person I called was Detective Ray Coleman from the Milwaukee Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Sarah Mitchell had given me his direct number, explaining that he specialized in elder abuse cases and would understand the urgency of my situation. When I reached him that Thursday morning, his voice was gruff but kind, the tone of someone who'd heard too many stories like mine. "Mrs. Peterson," he said after I'd explained the basics, "I need you to understand something right up front. What you're describing isn't just family drama or a misunderstanding. Forging someone's signature on legal documents is a felony. Identity theft, fraud, possibly conspiracy if your son was involved. These are serious criminal charges that could send people to prison." I sat in the basement, phone pressed to my ear, and felt a surge of validation. For months I'd been made to feel like I was overreacting, like I was being dramatic or paranoid. But Detective Coleman was confirming what I'd suspected. This was real criminal behavior, not just family dysfunction. "What I need from you," he continued, "is documentation. Photos of the forged documents, records of any financial transactions they've made using your identity, evidence of their attempts to isolate you or control your communications. Can you get me those things without arousing suspicion?" I assured him I could. Over the past week, I'd been systematically photographing every document I could find, creating a digital record of their fraud. I'd also been keeping detailed notes about every conversation, every incident, every example of their manipulation and control. "Good," Detective Coleman said. "I also need you to be very careful. If they realize you're onto them, they might accelerate their timeline or try to move assets out of reach. Can you continue to act normally while we build this case?" Acting normally meant continuing to live in the basement, continuing to accept their dismissive treatment, continuing to play the role of the declining, dependent mother-in-law. But now I had purpose and support, allies who believed me and were working to protect me. The performance was easier when I knew it was temporary. My next call was to Dr. Patricia Huang, my primary care physician for the past 15 years. I explained that I needed a comprehensive mental health evaluation, something that would document my cognitive abilities and mental competence. I told her about the fraudulent medical assessments that Cassandra and Marcus had apparently obtained, evaluations that painted me as confused and declining. "Norma," Dr. Huang said, her voice filled with concern, "I've been treating you for years, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with your mental faculties. You're sharper than most people half your age. If someone is claiming otherwise, they're lying, and we need to prove it." She scheduled me for a full neuropsychological evaluation the following week, tests that would thoroughly document my cognitive abilities and mental health. She also agreed to provide written statements about my medical history and current condition, evidence that would contradict any claims about my declining health or mental capacity. The hardest call was to my sister Margaret. I hadn't spoken to her in months, partly because Cassandra had been discouraging contact with family and friends, and partly because I'd been too embarrassed to admit how bad my living situation had become. When she answered, her voice was cautious, worried. "Norma, is everything okay? I've been so worried about you." "Every time I call, Cassandra says you're resting or not feeling well, and you never call me back anymore." I explained everything, from the gradual isolation to the basement living arrangements, to the discovery of the forged documents. Margaret was horrified, angry at herself for not pushing harder to see me, furious at Cassandra and Marcus for what they were doing. "You're coming to stay with me right now," she declared. "Pack your things and get out of there immediately." But I couldn't leave, not yet. If I disappeared suddenly, they'd know I was onto them, and they might destroy evidence or accelerate their legal proceedings. I needed to stay in place while Detective Coleman and Sarah Mitchell built the case against them. "I need you to do something else," I told Margaret. "I need you to start visiting me regularly, to document my living conditions and my mental state. I need witnesses who can testify that I'm being isolated and mistreated, people who can confirm that I'm mentally competent and fully capable of caring for myself." Margaret agreed immediately. She also offered to help me gather evidence, to be my eyes and ears in the community while I continued to hide my investigation from Marcus and Cassandra. Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own home, carefully documenting every aspect of their fraud and manipulation. I discovered that they'd been intercepting my mail, particularly anything that looked official or financial. I found copies of bank statements that showed unauthorized transactions, checks that had been forged with my signature, and correspondence with financial institutions that I'd never authorized. The scope of their theft was staggering. They'd been systematically draining my accounts, using my identity to take out loans and credit cards, and even attempting to refinance the house without my knowledge. The only reason the refinancing hadn't gone through was that the bank had required an in-person meeting, something they couldn't arrange without my cooperation. I also discovered evidence of their long-term planning. Hidden in Cassandra's desk, I found printed emails and documents that dated back more than a year, correspondence with lawyers and financial advisors about managing elderly relatives and protecting family assets. They'd been planning this theft from almost the moment they moved into my house. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was a recording I made of Cassandra talking to her friend on the phone. She was in the kitchen, probably thinking I was asleep in the basement, and her voice carried clearly through the old house's heating vents. "The old bat has no idea what's coming," Cassandra laughed. "Marcus feels guilty about it, but I keep reminding him that we're doing her a favor. She can't take care of herself anymore, and this house is worth a fortune. We'll put her in a nice assisted living facility, sell the house, and use the money to secure Emma's future." Her friend asked if I knew about their plans, and Cassandra's response made my blood boil. Of course not. She's completely oblivious, living in her little basement world, grateful for whatever scraps of attention we throw her way. By the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late to stop us. The guardianship papers are already filed, and Marcus has power of attorney. Legally, she's already toast. I recorded every word, my hands shaking with rage, as I listened to her casually discuss stealing my life and my freedom. This wasn't just financial fraud, it was a complete betrayal of trust, a calculated destruction of my independence and dignity. The recording also revealed something else. Marcus wasn't an unwitting victim of his wife's manipulation. He was a willing participant, complicit in the fraud and theft. This knowledge was devastating, the final destruction of any hope that my son might still love and respect me enough to do the right thing. Detective Coleman was impressed with the evidence I'd gathered. When we met at a coffee shop across town, careful to avoid being seen together, he reviewed my photographs and recordings with growing amazement. "Mrs. Peterson, this is one of the most comprehensive cases of elder abuse I've ever seen," he said, flipping through the photos on my phone. "The forged signatures, the unauthorized financial transactions, the isolation tactics, the fraudulent medical evaluations. They've committed multiple felonies, and you've documented everything beautifully." He explained the next steps in the investigation. He would work with the district attorney's office to prepare criminal charges, while Sarah Mitchell pursued civil remedies to protect my property and rights. The timing would be crucial. We needed to strike before they could complete their guardianship proceedings, or transfer any more of my assets. The challenge, Detective Coleman warned, is that this will tear your family apart permanently. Are you prepared for that? Are you ready to see your son and daughter-in-law go to prison? I thought about Marcus, about the little boy I'd raised and loved, about the man he'd become under Cassandra's influence. I thought about Emma, my granddaughter, who would grow up with her parents in prison because of my actions. The weight of these consequences was crushing, but the alternative was worse. They made their choice when they decided to steal from me, I said firmly. I won't be a victim anymore, no matter who gets hurt in the process. Sarah Mitchell was equally impressed with my evidence gathering, but she had different concerns about the legal strategy. As my attorney, her primary goal was protecting my interests, not necessarily seeking criminal justice. We have several options, she explained during our meeting in her downtown office. We can pursue criminal charges, which will likely result in prison time for both of them. We can pursue civil remedies, which would focus on recovering your stolen assets and protecting your property. Or we can negotiate a settlement that gets them out of your house and your life without destroying your family. The settlement option was tempting. It would be quicker, less public, and wouldn't result in my son going to prison. But it would also let them escape the consequences of their actions, and I worried they might target other elderly victims in the future. What happens to my granddaughter if her parents go to prison? I asked. That depends on several factors, Sarah replied. If they're both convicted, Emma might be placed with other relatives or in foster care. But you could petition for custody, especially if you can demonstrate that you're a stable, loving caregiver who was wrongfully excluded from her life. The idea of raising Emma, of being her primary caregiver and protector, was both thrilling and terrifying. At 73, was I prepared to take on the responsibility of raising a toddler? Did I have the energy, the patience, the physical capability to be a parent again? But as I thought about it more, I realized that this might be the only way to protect Emma from growing up with parents who were criminals and manipulators. If Cassandra could steal from her own mother-in-law, what would she teach her daughter about honesty and integrity? If Marcus could betray his own mother, what kind of father would he be when faced with difficult decisions? I want to pursue criminal charges, I decided. They need to face the consequences of their actions, and other families need to be protected from people like Cassandra. Sarah nodded approvingly. I think that's the right choice, both morally and strategically. A criminal conviction will make the civil case much stronger, and it will establish a clear record of their fraudulent behavior. We spent the next hour planning the legal strategy. Sarah would file emergency motions to freeze my accounts and protect my property, preventing them from transferring any more assets. Detective Coleman would coordinate with the district attorney to prepare criminal charges, and I would continue gathering evidence while acting normally to avoid arousing suspicion. The most difficult part of the plan was the waiting. I had to continue living in the basement, continue accepting their dismissive treatment, continue watching them steal my life while I pretended not to know what was happening. Every day was a performance, every interaction a careful balance between maintaining my cover and gathering information. Margaret began visiting regularly, ostensibly to check on my health, but actually to document my living conditions and mental state. Her presence in the house made Cassandra nervous, but there was nothing she could do to stop family visits without raising suspicions. During one of these visits, Margaret was appalled by what she saw in the basement. The space was cold and damp, despite my space heater. The ceiling was so low she couldn't stand upright, and the concrete walls made everything echo with a hollow, institutional sound. "This is inhumane," she whispered, looking around the cramped space that had become my world. "They're treating you like a prisoner in your own home." She took photos of everything: the narrow bed, the minimal lighting, the lack of proper ventilation, the boxes of my belongings stacked against the walls. These images would be crucial evidence of the isolation and abuse I was suffering. Margaret also documented my mental acuity and physical capabilities. She brought crossword puzzles and word games that I completed easily, recorded conversations that demonstrated my clear thinking and sharp memory, and witnessed my ability to handle complex tasks like managing my medication schedule and balancing my checkbook. "If anyone claims you're mentally incompetent," she said, "they're either lying or delusional. You're sharper than most people I know." Dr. Huang's neuropsychological evaluation confirmed what Margaret observed. The extensive testing showed that my cognitive abilities were well within normal ranges for my age, with some areas actually above average. There was no evidence of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would impair my judgment or decision-making abilities. Whoever conducted the previous evaluations that claimed you were declining either was grossly incompetent or deliberately falsified the results, Dr. Huang told me. Your mental faculties are excellent, and I'd be happy to testify to that effect in court. Armed with this professional assessment, I felt more confident about challenging their guardianship proceedings. They couldn't claim I was incompetent when a qualified neuropsychologist had thoroughly tested me and found no evidence of cognitive decline. The investigation revealed even more disturbing details about their criminal behavior. Detective Coleman discovered that they'd been using my identity to apply for credit cards and loans, racking up thousands of dollars in debt in my name. They'd also been collecting my Social Security checks, claiming they were managing my finances when they were actually stealing from me. Most shocking was the discovery that Cassandra had been researching assisted living facilities, specifically looking for places that accepted patients with dementia or other cognitive impairments. She'd been planning to have me committed to institutional care, using the fraudulent medical evaluations to justify locking me away. This wasn't just about stealing your house, Detective Coleman explained. This was about completely erasing you from your own life. She wanted you out of the way permanently so she could take over everything you'd worked for. The realization that I'd been targeted for complete destruction, not just financial exploitation, was devastating. Cassandra hadn't just wanted my money. She'd wanted my identity, my freedom, my very existence eliminated so she could take my place in my own life. But knowing the full scope of their plans also strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. It was about survival and justice. I couldn't let them destroy me, and I couldn't let them get away with targeting other vulnerable people in the future. The break in the case came when Detective Coleman's investigation uncovered additional victims. Cassandra had apparently used similar tactics against her previous boyfriend's elderly mother, manipulating the woman into signing over property before disappearing with the proceeds. She was a serial predator who targeted elderly people through their adult children, a con artist who specialized in long-term manipulation and financial abuse. This changes everything, Detective Coleman told me during one of our secret meetings. With multiple victims and a clear pattern of behavior, we can pursue more serious charges. This isn't just fraud, it's organized criminal activity. The district attorney's office was now fully invested in the case, recognizing that they were dealing with a sophisticated criminal operation rather than simple family dysfunction. They began preparing charges that could result in significant prison time, not just for the financial crimes, but for the pattern of elder abuse and exploitation. Sarah Mitchell used this new information to strengthen the civil case as well. With evidence of Cassandra's previous crimes, we could argue that I was the victim of a professional con artist, not a family member making poor decisions. This would make it easier to recover damages and protect other potential victims. The hardest part of this period was watching Emma, my granddaughter, and knowing that her world was about to be destroyed. She was a happy, healthy toddler who loved her parents and trusted them completely. She had no idea that they were criminals who were stealing from her grandmother, no understanding of the chaos that was about to engulf her life. I spent hours watching her play upstairs, listening to her laughter and babbling, aching to hold her and protect her from what was coming. I knew that pursuing criminal charges would likely result in her being removed from her parents' custody, but I also knew that leaving her with criminals and manipulators would damage her in ways that might never heal. During one of Margaret's visits, Emma wandered down to the basement, curious about the strange woman who lived beneath her house. She looked around the cramped space with wide eyes, then climbed onto my lap and asked why I lived in the underground room. "It's just temporary, sweetheart," I told her, fighting back tears. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make special arrangements until things get better." She nodded seriously, then asked if I was sad living down there. The innocence of the question broke my heart, but it also strengthened my determination to protect her from parents who would teach her that manipulating and stealing from family members was acceptable behavior. "I'm not sad when you visit me," I told her honestly. "You make everything brighter." Margaret later told me that this interaction convinced her we were doing the right thing. "That little girl deserves better than parents who are criminals," she said. "She deserves to grow up with people who will teach her right from wrong, not how to steal and lie." The legal preparations were nearly complete. Detective Coleman had gathered evidence of multiple felonies. Sarah Mitchell had prepared comprehensive civil filings, and Dr. Huang had documented my mental competence and physical capabilities. All that remained was choosing the right moment to strike. That moment came sooner than expected. During one of my careful searches of their paperwork, I discovered that they were planning to accelerate their timeline. Cassandra had scheduled a meeting with the guardianship court for the following week, apparently concerned that I was becoming suspicious of their activities. "We need to move now," Sarah Mitchell told me when I called with this information. "If they get guardianship approved, it becomes much more difficult to challenge, even with evidence of fraud." Detective Coleman agreed. "We've got enough to file charges and make arrests. The longer we wait, the more risk there is that they'll destroy evidence or flee." The plan was set in motion. Sarah would file emergency motions to freeze all financial accounts and protect my property. Detective Coleman would coordinate with uniformed officers to make the arrests, and I would finally emerge from the basement and reclaim my life. The night before the operation, I sat in my cramped basement room, surrounded by the evidence of months of careful investigation. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point, from the hopeful grandmother who'd welcomed her son's family into her home, to the determined woman who was about to send them to prison. I thought about the choices that had led us here, the small compromises and accommodations that had gradually stripped away my dignity and independence. I thought about the warning signs I'd ignored, the red flags I'd dismissed because I wanted so desperately to believe in the happy family we appeared to be. But mostly I thought about Emma, asleep upstairs in her crib, innocent and trusting and completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. I prayed that someday she would understand why I'd had to destroy her family to save her future, why I'd chosen justice over peace, truth over comfortable lies. Tomorrow, the basement would no longer be my prison. Tomorrow, I would reclaim my house, my independence, and my dignity. Tomorrow, Norma Peterson would emerge from the shadows and take back everything that was rightfully hers. The war was about to begin, and I was ready to fight. The morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that promised change, and I woke in the basement for what I hoped would be the last time. My phone buzzed at exactly 6 a.m. with a text from Detective Coleman. "Operations commence at 9. Stay in basement until all clear signal." I lay on that narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house waking up above me. Cassandra's alarm clock, the shower running, Emma's cheerful babbling as she was changed and fed, Marcus moving around getting ready for work. Normal morning sounds in what appeared to be a normal family home, except that by noon, 2 of those family members would be in handcuffs. My hands shook slightly as I made coffee on the small hot plate I'd installed in the basement. This was it. After months of investigation, documentation, and careful planning, today would determine whether I regained my life or lost everything in a failed gambit. Sarah Mitchell had warned me that even with overwhelming evidence, legal proceedings could be unpredictable, especially when they involved family members and elder abuse claims that judges sometimes viewed skeptically. At 7:30, I heard Marcus leave for work, his car pulling out of the driveway with its familiar engine noise. According to our plan, Detective Coleman would intercept him at his office, arresting him there to avoid a scene in front of Emma. Cassandra would be arrested at the house, where the search warrant would also be executed to secure any remaining evidence. I climbed the basement stairs quietly, knowing that Cassandra was upstairs getting Emma dressed and probably assuming I was still asleep. Through the kitchen window, I could see an unmarked police car parked across the street, Detective Coleman and his partner waiting for the signal to move in. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain everyone in the neighborhood could hear it. At exactly 9 a.m., my phone buzzed with a single word, "Go." I opened the front door and waved to the unmarked car. Detective Coleman and Detective Martinez approached the house with purposeful strides, their badges visible, their expressions professional and serious. Behind them, 2 uniformed officers took positions near the vehicles, ready to provide backup if needed. Mrs. Peterson, Detective Coleman said as they reached the porch, "We need you to step outside and stay clear while we execute the warrant." I moved to the sidewalk, my legs unsteady with adrenaline and anticipation. From across the street, Margaret emerged from her car, where she'd been waiting to provide support and witness whatever unfolded. She'd taken the morning off work, insisting that I shouldn't face this moment alone. The knock on the door was firm and authoritative. "Milwaukee Police, we have a warrant." I heard Cassandra's footsteps on the hardwood floor, her voice calling out, "Just a minute, please." There was a pause, probably while she looked through the peephole, then another pause that stretched longer than it should have. I imagined her panic as she realized this wasn't a routine visit or mistaken address. When she finally opened the door, her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Officers, I think there's been some mistake. We haven't called for any police assistance." "Ma'am, I'm Detective Coleman with Milwaukee PD. We have a warrant to search these premises and a warrant for your arrest. Please step outside with your hands visible." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Emma's voice, confused and frightened. "Mommy, why are the policemen here?" "Ma'am, we need you to comply immediately," Detective Martinez said firmly. "Is there anyone else in the house?" "My daughter." Cassandra's voice cracked slightly. "She's just a baby, she doesn't understand what's happening." "We'll make sure she's safe," Detective Coleman assured her. "But right now, we need you to step outside." I watched from the sidewalk as Cassandra emerged from my house, my home, the place she'd been systematically stealing from me for over a year. She looked smaller somehow, diminished without her usual confident demeanor. Her eyes found mine across the yard, and the look she gave me was pure venom, mixed with disbelief. "You," she hissed, loud enough for the neighbors who were starting to gather to hear clearly. "You did this. You called the police on your own family." Detective Martinez was already reading her rights, the familiar words carrying across the morning air like a benediction. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." But Cassandra wasn't remaining silent. As the handcuffs clicked into place, she began screaming accusations and threats that revealed more about her character than months of investigation ever could. "She's senile!" Cassandra shouted, struggling against the restraints. "She's confused and paranoid. She doesn't know what she's saying. We've been taking care of her because she can't take care of herself." The uniformed officers were searching the house now, following the detailed lists Sarah Mitchell had provided based on my documentation. They were looking for specific documents, financial records, and any evidence that hadn't already been photographed or copied during my covert investigation. Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching a stuffed rabbit and crying for her mother. The sight of my granddaughter's distress nearly broke my resolve, but Margaret squeezed my hand and reminded me why we were here. "That little girl deserves better than this," she whispered. "You're saving her from growing up with criminals." Detective Coleman approached me while his partner supervised Cassandra's transport to the police station. "Mrs. Peterson, we found additional evidence inside. Financial documents that weren't in your original photographs, and what appears to be a second set of forged signatures on mortgage refinancing papers. This is even bigger than we initially realized." The additional evidence was devastating to their case but vindicating for me. Hidden in Cassandra's desk, the officers had found a folder labeled Estate Planning that contained detailed timelines for taking control of my assets, communications with multiple lawyers about guardianship proceedings, and even research into the resale value of my house and its contents. Most damning was a notebook in Cassandra's handwriting that outlined her strategy for isolating me from family and friends, manipulating my living situation, and creating documentation of my supposed mental decline. It read like a criminal manual for elder abuse, complete with timelines, tactics, and contingency plans. "She documented her own crimes," Detective Martinez explained, flipping through the notebook. "Everything from the forged signatures, to the isolation tactics, to the financial theft. It's like she kept a diary of her criminal activity." The search also revealed evidence of other potential victims. Cassandra had been researching elderly individuals in the neighborhood, collecting information about their family situations, financial status, and potential vulnerabilities. She hadn't just targeted me, she'd been planning a wider campaign of elder abuse and financial exploitation. While the police completed their search, I sat on my own front porch, my real front porch, for the first time in over a year. The October sun felt warm on my face, and the familiar sounds of my neighborhood seemed precious after months of basement isolation. Margaret sat beside me, and we watched Emma play in the yard under the supervision of a female officer who'd been specially trained in child welfare situations. "What happens to her now?" I asked Detective Coleman when he joined us on the porch. "Child Protective Services has been notified," he explained. "Since her father will also be arrested today, she'll need temporary placement. Do you have family members who might be able to care for her?" Margaret immediately volunteered, but I surprised myself by speaking up. "I want to apply for temporary custody," I said firmly. "She's my granddaughter, and this is her home. If the court determines I'm capable, I'd like to care for her myself." Detective Coleman looked surprised. "Mrs. Peterson, caring for a toddler is a significant responsibility, especially given what you've been through. Are you sure you're prepared for that?" I looked at Emma, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, confused and frightened by the chaos around her. She was innocent in all of this, a victim of her parents' crimes just as much as I was. But unlike me, she was too young to understand what was happening or why her world was falling apart. "I've been a mother before," I said simply, "and I've been a grandmother who was kept from her granddaughter for too long. If she needs a home, she has one here." The logistics were complicated, but not impossible. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the house within an hour, already armed with preliminary paperwork for emergency custody proceedings. Dr. Huang had provided written statements about my physical and mental capabilities, emphasizing that I was fully competent to care for a child. Margaret offered to help with childcare and support, creating a family network that could provide stability for Emma during this transition. The most challenging moment came when the CPS caseworker, a kind woman named Janet Rodriguez, needed to explain to Emma what was happening in terms a 2-year-old could understand. "Your mommy and daddy need to go away for a while to take care of some grown-up problems," Janet told Emma gently. "But your grandma Norma is going to take care of you right here in your house until they come back." Emma looked at me with those wide, trusting eyes that children have before the world teaches them to be suspicious. "Grandma lives in the basement," she said matter-of-factly. "Not anymore, sweetheart," I told her, kneeling down to her level. "Grandma is going to live upstairs now, and you can live with me. Would you like that?" She nodded solemnly, then asked if she could show me her room. It was the first time I'd been upstairs in my own house as something other than an intruder in months. Walking up those familiar stairs, seeing the rooms I'd been banished from, felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into sunlight. Emma's nursery had been created in what used to be my sewing room, painted in soft pastels with expensive furniture that I now realized had been purchased with my stolen money. But it was beautiful, clearly designed by someone who loved this child, and I felt a pang of sadness for the family we might have been if Cassandra hadn't chosen greed over love. "This is where I sleep," Emma announced proudly, showing me her crib and toys. "And this is where Mommy reads me stories." I sat in the rocking chair that had once been mine, that had been moved from the living room to this nursery without my permission, and pulled Emma onto my lap. "Would you like me to read you a story?" I asked. She nodded enthusiastically and chose a book about a little rabbit who goes on adventures. As I read to her, I realized that this moment, this simple act of grandmotherly love, was what Cassandra had been trying to steal from both of us. Not just my house or my money, but the relationship between grandmother and granddaughter, the bond that should have been growing stronger instead of being systematically destroyed. The arrest of Marcus proved more dramatic than anyone had anticipated. When Detective Coleman and his team arrived at his accounting firm, Marcus initially tried to deny any knowledge of the fraudulent documents. But when confronted with the evidence, including the notebook detailing Cassandra's criminal plans and his own forged signature on power of attorney documents, he broke down completely. "I never wanted it to go this far," he confessed to Detective Coleman, his voice recorded for evidence. "Cassandra said it was just temporary, just until we could get on our feet financially. She said Mom would never know. that we'd take care of her and she'd be happier not having to worry about money and property management. But the evidence showed that Marcus's involvement went far beyond passive participation. He'd signed documents, attended meetings with lawyers, and actively participated in creating the false narrative about my mental decline. He'd been present during discussions about having me committed to assisted living, and he'd never once questioned the ethics or legality of what they were doing. "The thing that gets me," Detective Coleman told me later, "is that your son seemed genuinely surprised that forging someone's signature and stealing their money was illegal. Like he thought that because you were his mother, normal laws didn't apply." Marcus's arrest created additional complications for Emma's custody situation. With both parents facing serious criminal charges, the court needed to determine not just where Emma would live temporarily, but what would happen to her long-term if her parents were convicted and sentenced to prison. Sarah Mitchell worked quickly to file the necessary paperwork for emergency custody, but she warned me that the process would be scrutinized carefully by the court. "Judges are cautious about placing children with elderly relatives," she explained, "especially in cases where the elderly person has been victimized by the child's parents. They worry about the emotional and physical demands of childcare. But Dr. Huang's comprehensive evaluation of my capabilities proved invaluable. Her report documented not just my mental competence but my physical health, my emotional stability, and my demonstrated ability to care for myself and manage complex responsibilities." She'd also included observations about my interaction with Emma, noting the clear bond between us and my appropriate caregiving responses. "Mrs. Peterson shows no signs of cognitive decline or physical limitations that would impair her ability to care for a child," Dr. Huang wrote in her report. "She is alert, oriented, physically capable, and emotionally stable. Her love for her granddaughter is evident, and her commitment to the child's welfare is unwavering." Margaret's offer to provide support was equally important. As a retired teacher with experience in child development, she could offer both practical assistance and professional credibility to our custody application. Together, we could provide Emma with a stable, loving environment that prioritized her emotional and developmental needs. The court hearing for emergency custody was scheduled for the following week, but in the meantime, Janet Rodriguez from CPS was conducting a thorough evaluation of my home and my capabilities. This meant transforming the basement from my prison back into a normal storage area and converting the master bedroom from Marcus and Cassandra's space back into my own. The process of reclaiming my house was both liberating and emotionally exhausting. Every room held memories of how I'd been gradually pushed out of my own life, but also memories of the family I'd hoped we could be. Emma's presence made the transition easier. She needed stability and normalcy, which forced me to focus on creating a safe, welcoming environment rather than dwelling on the betrayals of the past. Clearing out Cassandra's belongings revealed even more evidence of her systematic deception. I found additional forged documents, including insurance policies that had been changed without my knowledge and investment accounts that had been opened using my identity. There were also personal items that belonged to me, things that had mysteriously disappeared over the months, hidden in her closet like trophies. Most disturbing was a collection of photographs she'd taken of me without my knowledge, pictures that showed me looking confused, disheveled, or unsteady on my feet. These had apparently been intended as evidence of my declining mental state, carefully staged moments that could be used to support claims of incompetence. "She was building a case against you from the beginning," Detective Coleman observed, looking through the photographs. "Every interaction was calculated. Every apparent kindness was actually gathering ammunition to use against you later. The realization that I'd been under surveillance in my own home, that my most vulnerable moments had been documented and weaponized against me, was deeply violating. But it also provided additional evidence of the premeditated nature of their crimes, proof that this wasn't a case of family members making poor decisions under financial pressure, but a calculated campaign of elder abuse and theft." Emma's adjustment to the new living arrangements was remarkably smooth, considering the trauma she'd experienced. Children are resilient, and she seemed to understand on some instinctive level that she was safe and loved, even if the adults in her life were dealing with complicated problems she couldn't understand. She helped me cook dinner in the kitchen I hadn't used freely in over a year, chattering about her day and asking innocent questions about why Mommy and Daddy had to go away. I answered, as honestly as I could, without traumatizing her further, explaining that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and need to fix them, but that she would always be loved and cared for no matter what happened. "Will you be my mommy now?" she asked one evening as I was tucking her into bed. "I'll be your grandma who takes care of you," I told her. "That's different from being a mommy, but it means I love you just as much." She seemed satisfied with this answer, and fell asleep holding my hand, her small fingers wrapped around mine with complete trust. In that moment, I knew that everything I'd gone through, all the pain and betrayal and fear, had been worth it to protect this innocent child from the chaos her parents had created. The preliminary court hearing was held in a small family courtroom with fluorescent lighting and institutional furniture that made everything feel cold and impersonal. Judge Patricia Wilson was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a reputation for thorough, thoughtful decisions in family cases. Sarah Mitchell presented our case methodically, documenting my mental competence, physical capabilities, and emotional stability. She submitted Dr. Huang's evaluation, Margaret's statement of support, and Janet Rodriguez's positive assessment of my home environment and caregiving abilities. The prosecutor representing the state's interest in Emma's welfare asked pointed questions about my age, my energy levels, and my ability to keep up with an active toddler. I answered honestly, acknowledging that caring for a child at my age would be challenging, but emphasizing my commitment to Emma's welfare and my extensive support network. "Your Honor," I said, when given the opportunity to speak directly to the court, "I know that 73 might seem old to be caring for a toddler. But I raised one child successfully, and I've been kept from my granddaughter for too long by people who are stealing from both of us. Emma needs stability and love, and I can provide both. I may not be young, but I'm healthy, I'm competent, and I'm absolutely committed to giving her the best life possible." Judge Wilson asked Emma's court-appointed advocate, a lawyer named David Chen who specialized in representing children's interests, for his recommendation. He'd spent several hours observing Emma with me, watching our interactions and assessing the quality of our relationship. "Your Honor," Mr. Chen said, "Emma Peterson clearly has a strong, loving bond with her grandmother. Mrs. Peterson demonstrates appropriate caregiving skills, emotional stability, and genuine commitment to the child's welfare. While caring for a toddler is certainly challenging for someone of Mrs. Peterson's age, she has demonstrated both the capability and the support system necessary to provide appropriate care." Judge Wilson granted temporary custody, with the understanding that the arrangement would be reviewed regularly and that CPS would continue to monitor Emma's welfare. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it gave Emma stability while her parents' criminal cases proceeded and while we worked toward a longer-term custody arrangement. Walking out of the courthouse with legal custody of my granddaughter felt like a victory, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Emma's parents were facing serious criminal charges that would likely result in significant prison time. I wasn't celebrating the destruction of my son's life, but I was relieved that Emma would be protected from growing up with parents who had demonstrated such a casual disregard for honesty and integrity. The criminal cases against Marcus and Cassandra proceeded more quickly than I'd expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence of their fraud and theft, both defendants were advised by their lawyers to consider plea bargains rather than risk longer sentences at trial. Cassandra's case was complicated by the discovery of her previous victims. Detective Coleman's investigation had uncovered at least 2 other elderly individuals who had been financially exploited by Cassandra using similar tactics. This pattern of bully behavior elevated her charges from simple fraud to organized criminal activity, which carried much more severe penalties. Marcus's cooperation with the investigation influenced his sentencing. He provided detailed information about Cassandra's methods, admitted his own culpability, and expressed genuine remorse for his actions. His lawyer argued that he had been manipulated by Cassandra, but the evidence showed that he had been a willing participant who understood the consequences of his choices. The plea negotiations revealed the full scope of their theft. They had stolen over $80,000 from my accounts, forged my signature on multiple documents, and attempted to fraudulently transfer ownership of my house. The financial damage was substantial, but the emotional and psychological damage was incalculable. Cassandra ultimately accepted a plea deal that resulted in a sentence of 6 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 4 years if she completed financial restitution and counseling programs. Marcus received a lighter sentence of 3 years, largely due to his cooperation and genuine remorse. The sentences meant that Emma would be without her parents for several years of her childhood, a reality that was both tragic and necessary. But it also meant that she would be protected from their influence during her most formative years, giving her the opportunity to develop her own moral compass and sense of right and wrong. The house that had been my prison became my sanctuary again. Emma and I established new routines, new traditions, and new memories that weren't tainted by manipulation and theft. We painted her room together, planted flowers in the garden, and read stories on the front porch swing that I'd been banned from using for over a year. Margaret became a regular presence in our lives, helping with childcare and providing the support system that made it possible for me to manage the demands of raising a toddler at my age. We hired a part-time nanny to help during the day, and I enrolled Emma in a quality daycare program that provided socialization and early childhood education. The financial restitution from Marcus and Cassandra's convictions helped pay for Emma's care and my legal expenses, though it didn't come close to covering all the costs of their theft. But money had never been the primary issue. Dignity, independence, and justice were far more valuable than any amount they could repay. Emma adapted to her new life with remarkable resilience. She asked about her parents occasionally, and I answered her questions honestly but age-appropriately. I told her that Mommy and Daddy had made some mistakes and needed to spend time fixing them, but that they still loved her and would see her again someday. The visits with her parents, supervised by CPS, were difficult for everyone involved. Marcus was genuinely remorseful and desperately wanted to maintain a relationship with his daughter, but Cassandra remained defiant, blaming everyone but herself for the consequences of her actions. Emma was confused by these visits, often clingy and upset afterward, which reinforced my determination to provide her with stability and consistency. 6 months after the arrests, I petitioned the court for permanent custody of Emma. The process was thorough and sometimes invasive, involving multiple home studies, psychological evaluations, and assessments of Emma's adjustment and development. But every evaluation confirmed what I already knew. Emma was thriving in my care, developing normally, and clearly bonded with me as her primary caregiver. Judge Wilson granted permanent custody with provisions for supervised visitation with Marcus once he was released from prison. Cassandra's parental rights were terminated entirely, based on the severity of her crimes and her continued refusal to acknowledge responsibility for her actions. Mrs. Peterson, Judge Wilson said during the final hearing, "This court is satisfied that you have provided exceptional care for Emma despite extraordinary circumstances. Your commitment to her welfare, your demonstration of appropriate caregiving, and your success in helping her adjust to these difficult circumstances reflect the best interests of the child." Emma was 3 years old when the custody became final, old enough to understand that she would be staying with Grandma Norma permanently. She seemed relieved by the certainty, no longer asking when Mommy and Daddy were coming home, but instead making plans for adventures with Grandma and Aunt Margaret. The house on Maple Street became truly ours, no longer a place of conflict and manipulation, but a home filled with laughter and love. I converted the basement back into storage space and turned Cassandra's former office into a playroom for Emma, complete with books and puzzles and art supplies. We established new traditions that had nothing to do with the painful past. Sunday morning pancakes, afternoon walks to the neighborhood park, bedtime stories in the rocking chair that had finally returned to its rightful place in the living room. These simple rituals created a foundation of stability and love that would help Emma navigate the complexities of her family history as she grew older. Marcus was released from prison after serving 2 years of his 3-year sentence. He was genuinely repentant and eager to rebuild his relationship with Emma, but the supervised visits were awkward and stilted. Emma remembered him but didn't really know him, and he struggled with the reality that she now called me Grandma and him Marcus rather than Daddy. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," he told me during one of these visits, "but I want you to know that I understand what I did was unforgivable. I betrayed you. I endangered Emma, and I threw away everything you'd given me out of greed and weakness. I looked at my son, this man who had once been the center of my world, who had grown up in this house and played in this yard and been loved unconditionally by parents who wanted nothing more than his happiness and success. The Marcus I saw now was broken, humbled by the consequences of his choices, genuinely remorseful but irredeemably changed. "I forgive you," I told him, surprising myself with the truth of those words. "Not because what you did was forgivable, but because holding on to anger won't help Emma or me build the life we need to live." He cried then, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him since his arrest. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he whispered. "No," I agreed, "you don't. But Emma deserves to have whatever relationship with you is possible without endangering her welfare. If you can prove that you've truly changed, that you understand the magnitude of what you did and why it was wrong, then maybe someday you can be a positive presence in her life again." The road to rebuilding any kind of relationship would be long and difficult, requiring Marcus to demonstrate through actions rather than words that he had genuinely changed. But for Emma's sake, I was willing to leave that door open, as long as her safety and emotional well-being remained the priority. Cassandra, on the other hand, remained unrepentant and manipulative, even from prison. Her letters to Marcus were filled with blame and self-pity, claiming that she had been the victim of circumstances and that I had overreacted to normal family tensions. She showed no understanding of the magnitude of her crimes or the impact they'd had on everyone involved. When her parental rights were terminated, she hired a new lawyer to appeal the decision, claiming that she had been railroaded by a biased legal system and that I had manipulated the situation to steal Emma from her rightful parents. The appeal was denied, but it demonstrated her continued refusal to accept responsibility for her actions. I made the decision to shield Emma from any contact with Cassandra, believing that exposure to someone so fundamentally dishonest and manipulative would be harmful to her development. This meant that Emma would grow up knowing that her birth mother existed, but understanding that she had made choices that prevented her from being part of Emma's life. 2 years after gaining permanent custody, I realized that raising Emma had given my life a purpose and joy that I hadn't expected to experience again. At 75, I was busier and more fulfilled than I'd been in decades, chasing after an energetic preschooler who filled our house with laughter and chaos. Emma started kindergarten at the neighborhood school where Margaret had taught for 30 years before retiring. She was bright, social, and well-adjusted, showing no signs of the trauma she'd experienced as a toddler. Her teachers described her as confident, kind, and curious, qualities that I hoped would serve her well as she navigated the complexities of her family history. The basement where I'd been imprisoned became Emma's favorite play space during rainy days. She called it the adventure room and created elaborate imaginary worlds among the storage boxes and old furniture. Sometimes I watched her play there and marveled at how a space that had represented my lowest point had become a source of joy and creativity for my granddaughter. The house on Maple Street was truly ours now, filled with new memories that outweighed the painful ones from those dark months. Emma's artwork decorated the refrigerator, her toys were scattered throughout the living room, and her laughter echoed through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. On quiet evenings, after Emma was asleep, I sometimes sat on the front porch and reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. I thought about the choices that had led Marcus and Cassandra down such a destructive path, about the warning signs I'd missed or ignored, about the strength I'd found when I thought I had none left. But mostly, I thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully upstairs in her own room, safe and loved and protected from the chaos her parents had created. She would grow up knowing that her grandmother had fought for her, that she was worth fighting for, and that love sometimes required difficult choices and painful sacrifices. The basement was empty now except for Christmas decorations and childhood memories stored in boxes. The master bedroom was mine again, filled with furniture I'd chosen and photographs that told the story of a life well lived despite its challenges. The kitchen hummed with the daily business of raising a child, and the living room rang with the sounds of games and stories and unconditional love. Norma Peterson had emerged from the basement, reclaimed her life, and built something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. The house on Maple Street stood as proof that sometimes the quietest people have the strongest foundations, and that even the deepest wounds can heal when love and justice work together to create a new beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.